Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. Easter Sunday, 1975. In Hamilton, Ohio, families gathered to celebrate with egg hunts and festive meals. But at 301 Minor Avenue, 41-year-old James Urban Ruppert was about to turn a day of celebration into one of America's most shocking family massacres. In less than 5 minutes, he would methodically murder 11 family members, his mother, brother, sister-in-law, and 8 nieces and nephews, ranging from just 4 to 17 years old. The children, dressed in their Easter best, some still clutching candy in their hands, never had a chance. What drives a man to annihilate his entire family? What warning signs were missed in the days before? And how did this quiet, unremarkable man transform into one of America's most notorious family killers? Today, we examine the Easter Sunday Massacre, a case that shocked a nation and forever changed a community's sense of safety. Let's begin. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Hamilton, Ohio, Easter Sunday of 1975 was meant to be a day of celebration, of family gatherings, of children hunting for colorful eggs hidden in backyards. But for one family, it would become the darkest day in their history, a day that would shock not only the local community, but the entire nation. The events of that fateful day began to unfold at 301 Minor Avenue, a modest 2-story home where the Ruppert family had gathered to celebrate the holiday. James Urban Ruppert, a 41-year-old unemployed man who lived with his mother, would soon commit one of the deadliest family massacres in American history, killing 11 members of his own family in less than 5 minutes. To understand how someone could commit such a horrific act against their own flesh and blood, we need to delve into James Ruppert's troubled past. Born on December 29, 1934, James was the younger of 2 sons born to Leonard and Charity Ruppert. His father, Leonard, was a strict, domineering man who worked as a railroad engineer. By all accounts, Leonard was particularly hard on his younger son, often belittling and criticizing him. When James was only 12 years old, his father died by suicide. This traumatic event had a profound impact on young James, leaving emotional scars that would never fully heal. Following his father's death, James's relationship with his mother became increasingly complex and codependent. Charity Ruppert, now a widow, transferred much of her attention and expectations to her sons, especially James. As James grew into adulthood, he struggled to find his place in the world. Standing at just 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing about 135 pounds, he was physically unimposing. Former classmates would later describe him as quiet and withdrawn, someone who kept to himself and rarely participated in social activities. He had few friends and seemed uncomfortable in social situations. After graduating from high school, James briefly attended college, but dropped out after just a few months. He then enlisted in the U.S. Army, but was discharged after a short period of service. Throughout his 20s and 30s, he drifted from one job to another, never finding stable employment or establishing a career. By the time he reached his early 40s, James was living with his mother in the family home on Minor Avenue. He had no wife, no children, no career, and very few prospects. His older brother Leonard Jr., in contrast, had built a successful life for himself. Leonard Jr. was married to Alma, and together they had 8 children. He worked as a supervisor at a local manufacturing plant and owned his own home. In many ways, Leonard Jr. had achieved the kind of conventional success that had always eluded James. This stark contrast between the 2 brothers' lives seemed to fuel a deep-seated resentment in James. According to those who knew him, he harbored a particular jealousy toward his brother's large, seemingly happy family. He also had a complicated relationship with his mother, who, according to some accounts, frequently compared him unfavorably to his more successful brother. In the months leading up to Easter 1975, James's life had taken several turns for the worse. He was deeply in debt, owing thousands of dollars to various creditors. He had recently lost his job as a draftsman and had no immediate prospects for employment. There were also rumors that his mother was considering selling the family home and moving in with Leonard Jr. and his family, which would have left James without a place to live. On the Saturday before Easter, James's behavior took an ominous turn. He visited several local bars, drinking heavily and engaging in target practice at a local shooting range. He was seen handling his collection of handguns, which included a .357 Magnum, a .22 caliber pistol, and an 18-shot .22 caliber automatic pistol. These were not new purchases. James had been an avid gun collector for years and was known to be a skilled marksman. As Easter Sunday dawned on March 30th, 1975, the Ruppert home on Minor Avenue was preparing for a family gathering. Charity Ruppert, then 65, was in the kitchen preparing the holiday meal. She had invited her elder son Leonard Jr., his wife Alma, and their 8 children to join them for Easter dinner. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 17, were dressed in their Easter best, excited about the holiday festivities. Around 4 p.m., James Ruppert returned home after another visit to a local bar. What happened next would become one of the most shocking episodes of family violence in American history. According to police reports and James's own later testimony, he entered the house armed with his 3 handguns. His mother was in the kitchen, while his brother Leonard Jr. was nearby. The rest of the family was scattered throughout the house, with some of the children watching television in the living room. Without warning or apparent provocation, James began shooting. He first killed his brother Leonard Jr. and his sister-in-law Alma. He then methodically moved through the house, shooting each family member he encountered. The children, caught completely off guard, had no chance to escape or defend themselves. In a matter of minutes, all 11 family members were dead. The victims were Charity Ruppert, 65, James's mother, Leonard Ruppert Jr., 42, James's brother, Alma Ruppert, 38, Leonard's wife, Leonard Ruppert III, 17, nephew, Michael Ruppert, 16, nephew, Thomas Ruppert, 15, nephew, Carol Ruppert, 13, niece, Anne Ruppert, 12, niece, David Ruppert, 11, nephew, Teresa Ruppert, 9, niece, John Ruppert, 4, nephew. After the shooting, James called the police himself. When officers arrived at the scene, they found him sitting calmly in the kitchen, surrounded by the bodies of his family members. The scene was so horrific that even veteran police officers were deeply shaken. The victims had been shot at close range, many of them multiple times, and were found throughout the house. Some of the younger children were still holding Easter candy in their hands. The community of Hamilton was stunned by the massacre. Minor Avenue, typically a quiet, unremarkable street in a working-class neighborhood, was suddenly the center of national attention. Neighbors who had known the Ruppert family for years struggled to comprehend how such violence could erupt in their midst. They were just a normal family, one neighbor told reporters in the aftermath. The children were always well behaved, playing in the yard. You'd never think something like this could happen here. In the days following the massacre, details began to emerge about James Ruppert's troubled mental state. Friends and acquaintances reported that he had become increasingly withdrawn and paranoid in the months leading up to the killings. He had expressed feelings of persecution and had made vague statements about taking care of things before Easter. James was arrested at the scene and charged with 11 counts of aggravated murder. His defense team would later argue that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that years of psychological abuse, financial stress, and perceived rejection had pushed him over the edge. The trial of James Ruppert began in July 1975, just a few months after the killings. The prosecution painted him as a cold, calculating killer who had methodically planned the massacre out of jealousy and resentment. They pointed to his activities the day before the killings, the drinking, the target practice, as evidence of premeditation. The defense, on the other hand, presented James as a deeply disturbed individual who had suffered a psychotic break. They called psychiatrists who testified that James was experiencing paranoid delusions at the time of the killings, believing that his family was conspiring against him. They also highlighted his history of depression and social isolation. In a somewhat unusual legal maneuver, James waived his right to a jury trial, opting instead to have his case heard by a 3-judge panel. This decision would prove significant in the outcome of the trial. After hearing all the evidence, the panel of judges found James Ruppert guilty of 11 counts of first-degree murder on July 23, 1975. However, they did accept the defense's argument that he was suffering from a mental illness at the time of the killings. As a result, instead of receiving the death penalty, which was then legal in Ohio, James was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. This verdict was not the end of the legal proceedings, however. James's defense team appealed the conviction, arguing that certain evidence had been improperly admitted during the trial. In 1982, the Ohio Supreme Court agreed and ordered a new trial. The second trial began in 1982, 7 years after the killings. This time, James Ruppert opted for a different strategy. Instead of pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, he pleaded guilty to 11 counts of murder, but mentally ill. This plea acknowledged his responsibility for the killings while still recognizing his mental health issues. The court accepted this plea, and James was once again sentenced to life in prison. Under the terms of his sentence, he would be eligible for parole after serving a minimum of 20 years. As the years passed, the Easter Sunday massacre began to fade from public memory, but for the residents of Hamilton, Ohio, especially those who had known the Ruppert family, the trauma lingered. The house on Minor Avenue stood empty for years, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had occurred there. Eventually, it was sold and occupied by new residents, though many in the community still referred to it as the Ruppert House. James Ruppert, meanwhile, became just another inmate in the Ohio prison system. He kept a low profile, rarely giving interviews or making public statements about his crimes. When he became eligible for parole in 1995, he chose not to apply, perhaps recognizing the slim chances of his release given the nature of his crimes. It wasn't until 2015, 40 years after the killings, that James Ruppert finally appeared before the parole board. By then, he was 81 years old and had spent more than half his life behind bars. The parole hearing was attended by several relatives of the victims who vehemently opposed his release. "He killed my entire family," said one relative who had not been present at the Easter gathering in 1975. "He robbed me of aunts, uncles, cousins. He doesn't deserve to walk free, no matter how old he is." The parole board agreed, denying James's request for release. They cited the heinous nature of his crimes and his apparent lack of remorse as factors in their decision. James was returned to the Warren Correctional Institution in Lebanon, Ohio, where he remains to this day. The Easter Sunday Massacre stands as one of the deadliest family mass killings in U.S. history. It predated many of the mass shootings that would later become tragically common in American society, and in some ways, it foreshadowed them. The image of a troubled, isolated individual turning violent against those closest to him has become an all-too-familiar narrative in the decades since. Criminologists and psychologists have studied the case extensively, trying to understand what drove James Ruppert to commit such a horrific act. Some point to his history of mental illness, his feelings of inadequacy compared to his brother, and his fear of being evicted from his mother's home. Others emphasize the role of alcohol and access to firearms. Still others see it as a case of a narcissistic personality disorder, with James unable to bear the perceived slights and rejections from his family. Whatever the precise psychological explanation, the Easter Sunday massacre remains a stark reminder of the capacity for violence that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. James Ruppert, the quiet, unremarkable man who lived with his mother, harbored depths of rage and resentment that exploded with devastating consequences on that Easter Sunday in 1975. The crime scene itself told a chilling story of the methodical nature of the killings. Forensic evidence showed that James had moved from room to room, shooting his victims at close range. Many of the victims had multiple gunshot wounds, indicating that James had fired additional shots to ensure they were dead. The children in particular had been shot in the face or head, suggesting a desire to obliterate their features. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was James's behavior immediately after the killings. According to police reports, after shooting all 11 family members, he calmly walked to the telephone and called the police. "There's been a shooting here," he reportedly said in a flat, emotionless voice. When officers arrived, they found him sitting quietly in the kitchen, surrounded by the bodies of his family. He offered no resistance when arrested and showed no visible emotion. During his initial questioning, James provided a bizarre and disjointed explanation for his actions. He claimed that his brother Leonard had been plotting to kill him and that he had acted in self-defense. He also made strange statements about government conspiracies and being under surveillance. These statements would later form part of his insanity defense, with his attorneys arguing that he was experiencing paranoid delusions at the time of the killings. The impact of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate family. The small community of Hamilton was deeply traumatized by the event. Schools in the area held special assemblies to help children process the tragedy, particularly since many of the victims were school-aged. Local churches held memorial services, and a community fund was established to help with funeral expenses. The media coverage of the case was intense, with newspapers across the country featuring the story on their front pages. The shocking nature of the crime, a man killing his entire family on Easter Sunday, captured the public's imagination in a particularly macabre way. Some reports sensationalized the killings, while others used them as a springboard to discuss broader issues of mental health, gun control, and family violence. In the years following the massacre, several books and articles were written about the case, attempting to make sense of James Ruppert's actions. One of the most comprehensive accounts was Easter Sunday Massacre by author Gregory Orfalea, which delved into James's troubled childhood and the dynamics of the Ruppert family. The legal proceedings in the case also raised important questions about the insanity defense and how society deals with mentally ill offenders. James's initial defense strategy, claiming that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, sparked debate about the criteria for legal insanity and whether someone who commits such a calculated act of violence could truly be considered insane. His second trial, in which he pleaded guilty but mentally ill, highlighted a legal middle ground that has since become more common in cases involving offenders with mental health issues. This plea acknowledges both the defendant's responsibility for their actions and their mental health condition, potentially allowing for specialized treatment within the prison system. For the few surviving members of the Ruppert family, distant cousins and relatives who were not present at the Easter gathering, the massacre left a legacy of grief and questions. Many of them have chosen to remain private, declining interviews and avoiding public discussions of the case. Others have become advocates for victims' rights or mental health awareness, trying to find some meaning in the senseless violence that claimed their loved ones. As for James Ruppert himself, he has now spent more than 4 decades in prison. According to prison records, he has been a model inmate, avoiding disciplinary issues, and participating in various educational programs. He has reportedly declined most opportunities for psychological treatment, however, and has never publicly expressed remorse for his actions. In a rare interview given to a prison psychologist in the 1990s, James reportedly said that he had no memory of the killings themselves, claiming that he had experienced a blackout during the critical minutes of the massacre. This claim has been met with skepticism by prosecutors and victims' advocates, who see it as a convenient way to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions. Despite James Ruppert's claims of memory loss, investigators and prosecutors have long maintained that the massacre was a calculated act. The evidence of his activities the day before, drinking at local bars, target practice at the shooting range, and handling his weapons, suggested a man preparing himself for violence, not someone in the grip of a sudden psychotic break. During his incarceration, mental health professionals who evaluated Ruppert noted a pattern of emotional detachment when discussing the crimes. One prison psychiatrist wrote in a 1985 report, "The subject displays a remarkable absence of affect when recounting the events of March 30th, 1975. There is no evidence of remorse, grief, or even recognition of the magnitude of his actions. This emotional flatness is consistent with certain personality disorders, but makes genuine rehabilitation questionable." The house at 301 Minor Avenue became a somber landmark in Hamilton. After standing empty for nearly 2 years following the massacre, it was eventually purchased by a local family who claimed to be unaware of its history when they first made the offer. Upon learning what had happened there, they considered backing out, but ultimately decided to proceed with the purchase, believing they could bring new life to a place marked by death. "We had to do a lot of work on it, physically and spiritually," the new owner told a local newspaper in 1979. "We blessed every room, painted everything, replaced the floors. We wanted to reclaim it as a place where a family could be happy again." Despite these efforts, the family reported occasional unsettling experiences, unexplained cold spots, doors that would close on their own, and the persistent feeling of being watched, particularly in the kitchen where several of the murders had occurred. After 5 years, they sold the house and moved away from Hamilton altogether. Subsequent owners have reported similar experiences, though many dismiss these stories as the product of overactive imaginations influenced by knowledge of the home's dark history. The house still stands today, its exterior renovated and modified over the years, but its address forever associated with the Easter Sunday massacre in the minds of longtime Hamilton residents. The psychological profile of James Ruppert has been studied extensively by criminologists and forensic psychologists. Dr. Eleanor Morrison, who reviewed the case for a 1998 study on family annihilators, noted several factors that made Ruppert's case particularly intriguing. Unlike many family annihilators who kill their spouses and children, often in response to perceived failures as providers or protectors, Ruppert killed his extended family, his mother, brother, sister-in-law, and their children, Dr. Morrison wrote. This suggests a different psychological mechanism, one rooted in long-standing jealousy, resentment, and a pathological sense of comparison between himself and his brother. Morrison also noted the significance of the timing, Easter Sunday, a day of family gathering and celebration. By choosing this day, consciously or unconsciously, Ruppert was making a statement about family itself, perhaps destroying the very institution that he felt had failed him throughout his life. The massacre had profound effects on the surviving Ruppert relatives. Charity Ruppert had a sister, Edna, who lived in Kentucky. Edna's daughter, Alma Jean, was particularly close to her cousins Leonard III and Michael, who were among the victims. In a rare interview given in 2000, Alma Jean described the lasting trauma of losing so much of her family in a single violent event. "For years, I couldn't celebrate Easter," she said. "I couldn't even look at Easter decorations in stores without feeling physically ill. It was like he stole not just my family, but also a holiday that should be about renewal and hope." Alma Jean also spoke about the complicated feelings of having a family member commit such a horrific crime. "There's this terrible shame that comes with it," she explained. "People look at you differently when they find out you're related to a mass murderer, like maybe there's something wrong with your blood, your DNA. I've spent decades trying to understand how someone from my own family could do something so monstrous, and I still don't have answers." The legal aftermath of the case continued long after James Ruppert's second conviction in 1982. In 1995, when he first became eligible for parole, several surviving Ruppert relatives organized to ensure he would remain incarcerated. They collected thousands of signatures on petitions and wrote impassioned letters to the parole board describing the devastating impact of his crimes. Although Ruppert chose not to apply for parole at that time, the family remained vigilant. When he finally did appear before the parole board in 2015, they were ready. More than a dozen relatives attended the hearing, some traveling from as far away as California and Florida, to speak against his release. "My mother lost her sister, her nephew, and 8 grandnieces and grandnephews that day," said one woman whose mother was Charity Ruppert's sister. "She was never the same afterward. She died still grieving for them, still having nightmares about what they must have experienced in their final moments. James Ruppert doesn't deserve freedom, not after what he took from us." The parole board's decision to deny release was unanimous. In their written statement, they cited not only the horrific nature of the crimes, but also Ruppert's apparent lack of insight into his actions. "The offender has failed to demonstrate genuine remorse or a meaningful understanding of the factors that led to his violence," the statement read. "Given the extreme brutality of his crimes and the risk he may still pose to society, the board finds that release would not further the interests of justice at this time." Under Ohio law, Ruppert became eligible for another parole hearing in 2020, but this was delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. When the hearing finally took place in 2021, Ruppert was 86 years old and in declining health. Once again, family members appeared to oppose his release, though in smaller numbers as many of the older generation had passed away. This time, Ruppert himself spoke more extensively than he had at previous hearings. According to those present, he appeared frail and confused at times, occasionally losing his train of thought. He expressed what some described as a shallow regret for his actions, but maintained that he had no clear memory of the actual killings. "I know I did a terrible thing," he reportedly told the board. "I've had to live with that knowledge for almost 50 years now. I'm an old man, and I'd like to die outside of prison walls." Despite his plea, the parole board again denied his request for release, citing the same concerns as before: the heinous nature of the crimes, lack of genuine remorse, and potential ongoing risk to society. Ruppert was returned to Warren Correctional Institution, where he remains to this day, one of the oldest inmates in the Ohio prison system. The Easter Sunday Massacre has been the subject of numerous documentaries, books, and academic studies over the years. In 2005, the crime was featured in an episode of the television series Most Evil, which examined the psychological profiles of notorious killers. Forensic psychiatrist Michael Stone, who developed a 22-level scale of evil to categorize murderers, placed Ruppert at level 15, cold-blooded killing of multiple family members, noting that while his actions were undoubtedly monstrous, there was evidence of severe mental disturbance rather than pure sadistic pleasure in causing suffering. In 2015, On the 40th anniversary of the killings, the Hamilton Journal-News published an extensive retrospective on the case, interviewing police officers who had responded to the scene, prosecutors who had worked on the case, and community members who remembered the impact of the massacre on the small city. Retired Detective Frank Stout, who was one of the first officers to arrive at the Ruppert home that Easter Sunday, described the scene as something out of a nightmare. Even after 4 decades, his voice trembled as he recounted what he had witnessed. "I've seen a lot of terrible things in my career, but nothing comes close to what I saw in that house," Stout said. The children, they were just innocent children in their Easter clothes. Some of them were still holding candy. How anyone could do that to children, let alone their own nieces and nephews, is beyond my comprehension. Former prosecutor John Holcomb, who had worked on the original case, expressed frustration with the outcome of the trials. "We wanted the death penalty," he said bluntly. What James Ruppert did warranted the ultimate punishment. The fact that he's still alive, still being housed and fed at taxpayer expense, while 11 members of his family have been in their graves for 40 years, there's no justice in that. Community members shared memories of how the massacre had changed Hamilton. Many spoke of a loss of innocence, a new awareness of the potential for violence lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life. "Before it happened, we never locked our doors," said one woman who had lived a few blocks from the Ruppert home. Afterward, everyone started locking up, watching their neighbors differently, being more suspicious. It was like a curtain had been pulled back, showing us something dark that we couldn't unsee. The psychological impact of the massacre extended to the first responders and investigators who worked the case. Several reported experiencing symptoms of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder: nightmares, flashbacks, difficulty sleeping, and emotional numbness. In the 1970s, however, there were few resources available to help law enforcement personnel process the trauma of what they had witnessed. "We were just expected to tough it out," recalled one officer who had helped process the crime scene. "There was no counseling, no debriefing, nothing like that. You saw horrible things, and then you went home to your family and tried to act normal. A lot of guys turned to drinking to cope. Some marriages didn't survive it." The massacre also had a profound impact on how law enforcement in Hamilton and surrounding communities approached cases of domestic violence and mental health issues. In the aftermath, the police department instituted new training protocols for recognizing warning signs of potential family violence and established better coordination with mental health services. One of the few positive things to come out of this tragedy was a recognition that we needed to do better at identifying people in crisis before they became violent, said former Hamilton Police Chief William Sanderson in a 2010 interview. "We can't say for certain that different interventions would have prevented what James Ruppert did, but it made us all more aware of the need to take threats and warning signs seriously. For criminologists, the Easter Sunday massacre represents an important case study in family annihilation." Dr. Neil Websdale, director of the Family Violence Institute and author of Familicidal Hearts, The Emotional Styles of 211 Killers, has studied the Ruppert case extensively. What makes the Ruppert case particularly significant is the combination of factors at play, Dr. Websdale explained in a 2018 interview. "You have long-standing family dynamics, including a difficult relationship with his father who died by suicide, economic stresses, perceived humiliation and inadequacy compared to his brother, and the imminent threat of losing his home. These created a perfect storm of circumstances that, combined with his access to firearms and alcohol use, culminated in catastrophic violence." Websdale also noted the significance of Ruppert's affect after the killings: his calm demeanor, lack of apparent emotion, and immediate surrender to police. "This emotional flatness is actually quite common in family annihilators," he said. It suggests a psychological state where the perpetrator has detached from normal emotional responses, perhaps as a way of managing overwhelming feelings of rage, shame, or despair. The question of whether James Ruppert was truly insane at the time of the killings, or simply a cold-blooded killer who methodically eliminated his family, continues to be debated by legal and mental health experts. Ohio's legal standard for insanity at the time required that a defendant, because of mental illness, either did not know what they were doing was wrong or could not control their actions. Dr. Walter Afield, a psychiatrist who testified for the defense during Ruppert's first trial, maintained that Ruppert was experiencing paranoid delusions at the time of the killings. He believed his family was conspiring against him, that they were going to have him committed to a mental institution, Dr. Afield testified. In his delusional state, he saw killing them as an act of self-preservation. Prosecutors, however, pointed to the methodical nature of the killings and Ruppert's activities the day before as evidence of premeditation and awareness of wrongdoing. A man who spends the day drinking and practicing his marksmanship, then systematically executes 11 family members, knows exactly what he's doing, prosecutor John Holcomb argued during the trial. This wasn't a sudden psychotic break. This was a planned massacre. The ultimate legal determination, guilty but mentally ill, represented a compromise between these viewpoints, acknowledging both Ruppert's responsibility for his actions and his mental health issues. This verdict meant that Ruppert would serve his sentence in prison rather than a psychiatric facility, but would receive mental health treatment while incarcerated. As James Ruppert approaches his 9th decade of life, still behind prison walls, the Easter Sunday Massacre stands as a chilling reminder of the potential for violence within family relationships and the devastating consequences when personal grievances and mental illness culminate in extreme violence. For the community of Hamilton, the passage of time has dimmed but not erased the memory of that terrible Easter Sunday. Each year, as the holiday approaches, local newspapers often run articles remembering the tragedy, and some churches in the area include the Ruppert family in their Easter prayers. The graves of the 11 victims lie in a local cemetery, marked by a large headstone that bears all their names. On Easter Sunday, it's not uncommon to find fresh flowers placed there by community members who still remember the shock and grief that enveloped their city in the spring of 1975. The legacy of the Easter Sunday Massacre extends beyond Hamilton, serving as a grim case study for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and researchers studying family violence. The warning signs that preceded Ruppert's rampage, his increasing isolation, financial troubles, alcohol abuse, and preoccupation with guns, are now recognized as potential indicators of risk that might warrant intervention. As for James Urban Ruppert himself, his life has been defined by a single day of violence that transformed him from an unremarkable, troubled man into one of America's most notorious family killers. Now in his late 80s, he will likely spend his remaining days in prison, remembered not for anything he achieved in life, but for the lives he violently ended on an Easter Sunday nearly half a century ago. The case continues to resonate because it strikes at our most fundamental assumptions about family as a source of safety and support. The idea that someone could methodically kill their entire family, including young children, violates our deepest social norms and forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the human capacity for violence, especially toward those we are supposed to love and protect. In the decades since the massacre, mass shootings have become tragically common in American society, but family annihilations like the Ruppert case remain relatively rare and particularly disturbing. They remind us that sometimes the greatest danger can come not from strangers or external threats, but from within the family circle itself, from the complex web of relationships, expectations, and resentments that bind relatives together. As one criminologist noted, The Ruppert case forces us to acknowledge that family relationships, which should be our strongest source of support and connection, can sometimes become the focal point for our deepest rage and most destructive impulses. Understanding why and how this happens remains one of the most challenging questions in the study of violent crime. For the few people who still visit James Ruppert in prison, mainly chaplains and occasionally mental health professionals, he has become an enigmatic figure, a man who committed an act of almost unimaginable violence, yet appears, by all accounts, utterly ordinary in his day-to-day interactions. This contradiction between the horror of his crimes and the banality of his prison existence only deepens the mystery of what truly happened inside his mind on that Easter Sunday in 1975. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Easter Sunday massacre is not just the number of victims or their relationship to the killer, but the ordinariness of the setting and circumstances. It happened not in some remote, troubled location, but in a modest home on a quiet street in a typical American town, during a holiday celebration that millions of families were enjoying at that very same moment. This reminder that violence can erupt in the most seemingly normal contexts continues to haunt those who study and remember the case, making the Easter Sunday massacre not just a tragic historical event, but a sobering cautionary tale about the fragility of peace and the unpredictability of human behavior.